There's this phenomenon that's bothered me for as long as I've been arguing in the public forum, and I call it argument saying. It's when somebody presents an argument without any awareness or even consideration for whether or not this argument actually advances their position. To me, it suggests a mentality of being familiar with the tendency of intelligent people to argue for their positions without the actual intelligence to formulate an argument for one's position or even realize that's something you're supposed to be doing. And this is something you can see in most sides of most arguments. There are bad arguers everywhere, but there is one thing in particular that I only ever see defended with these types of arguments: the Electoral College. Obviously, this isn't the kind of thing I usually talk about on this channel, but I do try to apply the logic that I apply to the main topic of this channel to everything else in life, and it does matter to me that if you're a member of my audience, you're able to appreciate applying logic to all things, not just the area on which we probably agree if you're a general fan of my channel. And of course, on that note, a big thank you to all those who support what I'm doing on this channel in applying logical argumentation to bad ideas by giving on Patreon. You're all very appreciated. So this should be going up the day after the elections happened, although I believe I'm right that we might not know who the winner is yet. I am quite excited to find out. I'm recording this video quite in advance, but obviously I wanted to talk about this since the election's happening, and like I say, the Electoral College is one of the most stupid things that's only defended with the most stupid argumentation, so I just couldn't resist talking about it. And I'm going to present this critique in the form of a numbered list of my top 9 reasons why the Electoral College is stupid. It was going to be the more traditional top 10, but these reasons are so solid and so damaging to the credibility of the Electoral College that 10 would have been overkill. Number 1, the US is a democracy. This is a pretty obvious one. The US is a democracy. The Electoral College is clearly undemocratic, so they shouldn't have it. But really, this is intended to bring out the stupid people who will make the comment, the US isn't a democracy, it's a republic. Now, to any intelligent person, that sounds really stupid. Republic means rule of the people, the public, and democracy means rule of the people, the demographic. Defined beyond their etymology, republic tends to mean the opposite to a monarchy. The Republic of Ireland is a republic because they do not have a monarchy, while the United Kingdom is not a republic, even though some of us wish it was. France has been a republic. Indeed, they like being a republic so much that they've been 5 separate republics in their history, and that's because they have twice overthrown a monarchy. So the US is a republic like many other countries in the Western world, and like those other countries, it is also a democracy. Most countries in the Western world are democratic republics. Indeed, the US has representatives who are elected under a system of universal suffrage. I don't know how anyone can claim the US is anything other than a democracy. The main argument I've heard is people acting as if a democracy must be a direct democracy. In the very earliest days of democracy in ancient Greece, it used to be that citizens would directly vote on pieces of legislation, and this kind of direct vote on a singular piece of legislation is something that many countries still do today, including, by the way, the United States. But most legislation nowadays isn't passed by a direct popular vote, rather representatives are elected democratically to vote on legislation. This is the stupid thing about claiming America isn't a democracy. The only way you could define democracy to mean that America isn't a democracy would basically entail that no country is a democracy. The US saying, well, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Even if you grant that means not a direct democracy, there are many countries that are not direct democracies and are in fact republics, and none of those countries have decided to adopt the Electoral College system. I should say, having mentioned ancient Greece, that there is a distinction made between a democracy and a republic in the works of Plato in his appropriately titled book, The Republic. But his vision of a republic was to have philosopher kings who would be these very intelligent, wise people that would rule over the masses. And whatever you think of that as an idea, I hope we can all agree that a few random people in Pennsylvania who will be deciding who is in charge of the United States can't really be considered philosopher kings. So it seems like there is no meaningful way in which we can say the US is not a democracy but is a republic, certainly nothing that distinguishes it from other countries, again considering the fact that no other country has decided to have this Electoral College system. So just saying we're not a democracy, we're a republic, clearly doesn't justify the Electoral College system, and indeed since the US is a democracy and the Electoral College is undemocratic, obviously that's a big reason why they shouldn't have it. Number 2, it's a tyranny of the arbitrary minority. There's this famous quote, democracy is 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. It's a very stupid quote, of course, because in reality there's almost always more sheep than wolves, as indeed there are usually more prey than there are predators, otherwise the predators would go hungry very quickly. You might say this is taking the analogy too far, but really this applies to anything. Any sort of predatory system is going to have a smaller number of predators than prey. Indeed, that's why all exploitative hierarchies are pyramid-shaped. From a dodgy company with no workers' rights and a really rich boss, to a high-control cult, to a financial system where the very richest people benefit a huge amount while the poorest, most desperate people lose everything, there is one commonality. The richest predatory class would not win if it was put to a democratic vote. Now, of course, you can have systems where there is a minority being oppressed. The obvious example would be an ethnic minority. If there is a majority of people who hate a particular ethnic minority, then obviously if that's put to a democratic vote, if some decision's put to a democratic vote about how the ethnic minority should be treated, that could be dangerous. But the point is that most of the time, the people doing the oppressing are actually likely to be the minority with a lot of undemocratic power. And as such, that's generally what we avoid by having a democracy. But you can, in having a democratic system, yes, have what's rightly called a tyranny of the majority. Now, of course, this shouldn't be surprising because there really is no such thing as a tyranny-proof system. So obviously, if you've got a democratic system where things are decided by popular vote, then if there's going to be tyranny, it will be a tyranny of the majority. That's just how things are inevitably going to be. But what we should be able to agree is easily much worse, and also much more likely to happen than a tyranny of the majority, is a tyranny of the arbitrary minority, where one group of people, for no real reason, no good reason, get to make all the decisions even though they're a tiny group. I mean, that's how a monarchy works, and I thought America fought a whole war to escape from that arbitrary minority rule. It doesn't really matter by what method this arbitrary minority is selected. It could be hereditary, where it's basically just your bloodline, or it could be anything else, but as long as we're agreeing it is arbitrary, and in these cases it definitely is arbitrary, clearly that's worse than having a simple majority rule. Obviously, if there's a rationale for why we have this particular minority that has more power, like for example the philosophy kings, where you'd say these people are especially intelligent and that's why they should have more power than the average person, that's one thing, but you do need to present that rationale if you're going to say a minority should be able to make a decision for why it is that minority is uniquely qualified to override the popular vote. The problem is, with the Electoral College, there's no reasoning for why a particular minority gets to decide who's in charge. It pretty much just comes down to the quite arbitrary and unpredictable distribution of the votes, where if a few more people lived in a slightly different state, or you move the state borders around a tiny bit, you would get a completely different result in an election. Why is it that a few random people in Florida or Ohio or Arizona should be the deciders in who rules the entire country? We know there's no reason, there's no justification for it. It's just the way that the votes happen to be distributed that makes these people arbitrarily have a massively disproportionate amount of power. A tyrannical arbitrary minority is how a monarchy works or an oligarchy works, and clearly those are terrible systems. There's no such thing as a good tyranny, but why is it that anyone should prefer the arbitrary tyranny of the Electoral College over the potential risk for maybe a tyranny of the majority that happens if we just let the decision be a straight majority vote? Number 3, it narrows the focus of politicians. I could make this video a lot longer and a lot more painful if I looked at some of these specific videos people have made arguing for the Electoral College. I say it will be painful because the arguments are always really stupid. One specific video by a channel called Policy Ed, though, is pretty instructive as to how stupid these videos can be. For example, at one point they say this:
the Electoral College requires candidates to broaden their national appeal.
It's literally the opposite. Obviously, famously, under the Electoral College, candidates only focus on a tiny number of swing states, and not even the whole swing state, just a very small proportion of that swing state that they think they might be able to win over to their side. The consequence of this is that people living in safe states get completely ignored. I'm sure there are people with conservative values in New York, California, Washington, but the Electoral College means there's literally no point paying attention to those people. Indeed, if a Conservative Party actually did try to have a broad appeal and appeal to conservatives across the United States, that would be to their disadvantage, because all of the conservative voters in safe blue states wouldn't be of any help to them at all, and they would be wasting resources and time that they could otherwise spend focusing on winning over the people who would actually win the election for them, the conservatives and maybe more centrists in these swing states that are the states that are ultimately going to decide the election. The video claims that this serves to reduce polarization.
Each party already tends to represent the interests of particular states instead of the whole country. Removing the Electoral College would increase this favoritism and increase the polarization that already exists.
Again, it's literally the opposite. This video is basically saying that if you rack up a huge number of votes in one specific state, then that's not really worth anything. And that logic only makes sense if you're assuming that each individual state only has one type of voter in it. If a candidate is able to get 95% of the vote in one state, that actually shows that they have incredibly broad appeal, because they're able to appeal to the people in that state who are going to be of all sorts of different political opinions, all sorts of different religions, all sorts of different races, all sorts of different lifestyles, all sorts of different religions from all sorts of different economic backgrounds. That suggests very broad appeal, even though it's just focused on one state. The only logic for suggesting otherwise is to assume that indeed every single person from a particular state is all exactly the same. So if you win 95% of the vote in Minnesota, well, who cares? Because they're just Minnesotans. You've only really convinced one kind of person. Whereas in reality, we know that Minnesotans can be incredibly diverse. So actually, if 95% of them voted for you, that shows you do have a very broad appeal. So this video is arguing that every single person in a state has the same politics, and as such they are contributing to polarization in the United States. There are conservatives in blue states and liberals in red states, but it's the Electoral College that encourages politicians to ignore those minority opinions and specifically not try to have a broad appeal to all sorts of different people. As a final point, consider the fact that there are more women than men, and this is, I believe, true across the entire United States. So, if you had a candidate who only appealed to women, and they didn't get a single vote from any man, but they got every single vote from a woman, that candidate would win the Electoral College in a landslide. They'd win by 100%, because they would win every single state and, obviously the District of Columbia. But does that show they have broad appeal? No, the opposite. They only appeal to women. They don't appeal to any men. For 50% or just under 50% of the population who are male, they aren't appealing at all. But the Electoral College means that we're pretending that actually they got 100% of support. That's the mandate they're getting. Without the Electoral College, every single vote counts. So politicians have every reason to check every square inch of the country to find voters and appeal to them and bring them onto their side. With the Electoral College, they're free to ignore the vast majority of the country and only focus on a handful of swing states, and like I say, a very specific minority of the population of those swing states. So it doesn't broaden the focus of politicians at all. Number 4, it places undue significance on states. Up until this point, I haven't really focused on the fact that the Electoral College gives slightly more votes to less populated states, because overall that's not the biggest issue with it. For example, the UK doesn't have this system of disproportionately favouring smaller areas in elections, and yet we still have incredibly disproportionate results here. We recently had a very evil, corrupt Prime Minister elected with 34% of the vote, and that's being treated as if it's a landslide because our crappy electoral system makes it seem like he had way more of a mandate than he actually did. The real issue is having a series of local elections where if you win the vote by just over 50%, or maybe even less than that, then the system basically pretends that 100% of the people in that area voted for you. So compared to that, the slight weighting in favour of small states isn't really a big issue, but it is very stupid for one simple reason. States in the US don't really matter. They're kind of arbitrary. And the obvious piece of evidence, that means no one can deny that, is the abundance of straight lines in the borders of the US states. The only state that doesn't have any straight lines in its border is Hawaii, and that's just because their border is the coastline. So when you look at these borders and you realize how arbitrary they are and how recently many of these borders have formed, you realize it's kind of stupid to say people need special representation because of what state they come from. UK counties have substantially more robust history in terms of how they formed, and that's why they have very complicated borders, because they formed over centuries and if not even approaching 1,000 years ago. So of course, people are going to, in the UK, have a very genuine and legitimate sense of identity regarding the county they're from, but even then we'll move around from county to county and not think too much of it, just as is true in the US with the vast majority of states, although there are some notable exceptions. But definitely there's no reason why most of these states can't be cut up or combined in all sorts of arbitrary new ways. For example, it's kind of stupid to say, well, Vermonters are actually a very small proportion of the United States, so they should get special representation as Vermonters, when in reality they're very similar to the rest of New England. Most of New England, those 6 states, are all pretty much you could easily group them together as one state, and as such you say, actually, there are quite a lot of New Englanders, so maybe they should get less representation than the average person from another state. Conversely, it doesn't really make much sense to say, well, Californians should get less representation per person because there's so many Californians, when in reality, Southern California is completely different from Northern California. Certainly the difference between Southern California and Northern California is much bigger than the difference between Vermont and New Hampshire or any of the other New England states. I realize the US Constitution was drawn up after the American Revolution, where you had 13 colonies that were genuinely considering becoming 13 distinct countries, and I do recognize that historical precedent there, and how obviously back in the day, each individual state or colony as it was would have been very important. But I'll see your American Revolution and raise you the Civil War. The US Civil War quite conclusively established that the United States was going to be, first and foremost, united. And then westward expansion happened, and you got even more new states drawn up with, like I say, all sorts of arbitrary borders. And at this point, I'm sorry, but I just think it's ridiculous if you're saying it's really important that we make sure South Dakotans are recognized as minorities, and we understand and try to accommodate for the fact that they might be less common than Nevadans. And it's very important that we recognize those two distinct identities and make sure that neither gets an unfair amount of extra representation just based on the fact more people live there. States are grouped together into all sorts of ecological, cultural, and economic regions all the time, and other states are split up due to the internal divisions they have. So with all that said, to say that the specific state someone's from is such an important thing that it warrants special representation and consideration in how votes are distributed in the Electoral College is just obviously nonsense. Number 5, it ignores other demographic categorizations. Now, you might say, well, I'm just not realizing how important states are to people. If you're a particularly stupid American exceptionalist, you might think that America is the only place that has something like states, and I just couldn't understand the idea of having this sense of allegiance to a small part of your country rather than the country as a whole. Of course, I can understand that somebody would identify with their state, but people identify with where they're from on all sorts of levels. I mean, New Yorkers identify with the specific borough that they come from. Does that mean each individual borough of New York deserves its own special representation in the Electoral College? But the big issue is if you're going to say we need special representation for minority populations in the United States, you're going to have to justify why you're only saying that with a mind to the state that somebody comes from, rather than the myriad other ways that somebody might define themselves. America is a country with a very complicated relationship to race, and there are many African Americans who feel a much stronger sense of association with fellow African Americans in the state next door, or even across the country, than they do with the white person living just down the road from them. So Americans define themselves significantly by race. Why shouldn't racial minorities get extra representation in the Electoral College? How are you going to say that Vermonters deserve extra representation in this system because there aren't many Vermonters? Well, not many Americans are black. Black people are the minority compared to the white population, so should black people get extra votes, bonus representation to account for the fact they're minorities? What about religion? I mean, I hope if you take your religion remotely seriously, that's going to be one of, if not the most important ways that you define yourself. What state you're from, that's something that can change due to a new economic opportunity, or you get married. There's loads of reasons you might move from one state to another. But religion, we're talking about the eternal destiny of your soul. Surely that matters more than what state you come from. So, how about extra bonus representation for people of certain religious minorities? How about bonus representation for people of certain age groups, certain education levels, certain industries, certain sexual orientation? These are all important ways that someone might define themselves. So if you're going to say, well, it's really important the Electoral College protects people from Wyoming or some other state with a relatively small population, that's really important. Well, there's plenty of other ways in which someone can be a minority, so is that equally important? You'd think so, if for a lot of people, that's going to be a more important way that they define themselves compared to their state. So yes, this feature of the Electoral College, the way it seeks to give special extra representation to people based on what state they come from, is clearly obviously very stupid. Number 6, it drowns out rural voters. This point is kind of building off what we said so far. First of all, many people act as if helping smaller states automatically translates to helping rural voters, but that's obviously not true. There are states which are disadvantaged by the Electoral College that are very rural, like for example Texas. By contrast, DC is helped by the Electoral College, and that's literally just a whole city. One of the arguments for the Electoral College is that if it's just cities versus rural voters, then the rural voters will lose out. But under the Electoral College right now, rural voters in certain states have their vote count for literally nothing. Farmers living and working in Illinois have their vote completely drowned out by Chicago, which is a city that could be up to 350 miles away. If you support the Electoral College because you don't want rural voters to be overwhelmed by urban voters, you're an idiot, especially if you've ever posted this stupid map on screen right now. What you're basically saying in posting this and making this argument is that rural voters having their vote drowned out by people living in cities on the national level is absolutely terrifying and it's a complete travesty, but therefore we should have an Electoral College where in certain states rural voters will have their votes count for completely nothing because the city will decide the entire way that all the votes for that state go. Granting that city voters are mostly Democrats and rural voters are mostly Republican, I tell you what I'd do if I was a Democrat. Firstly, I'd get Republicans to go on the record saying they support the Electoral College. Perhaps even specifically they support the Electoral College because it helps to defend the rights of rural voters. And then, just to troll, I would come up with a high-speed rail network that would connect a whole load of big cities that I would create in all of the states in the United States, and I would create incentives so urban voters are encouraged to move to those states, and I'd make it so they're just enough perfectly distributed so every single state has a large city in it to drown out the rural voters. And now those rural voters who, otherwise maybe their votes would have counted for a significant amount, get their votes count for literally nothing, because as long as there's a big city in the state to overwhelm the rural vote, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many rural voters there were in that state before. Now the urban people are deciding where all the votes for that state go. And while I'm suggesting doing that out of spite, it's not impossible that could just happen organically. I mean, hopefully the US will start to get more of a high-speed rail network, and at that point, maybe all of the major cities won't have to be so clustered together. Maybe you could start to see them spread out, in which case maybe you would get some big major cities in some states that otherwise don't have them. I mean, right now we've already kind of got that happening in Texas, where their population is becoming increasingly urban, and their politics is changing in accordance with that. And it seems like at some point, the rural voters in Texas will find that their vote no longer counts for anything because there's an urban population, but really, because of the Electoral College. Number 7, there's no need for local elections. I've already acknowledged that the UK electoral system is pretty crap. In basically all of our elections, we've had the winning party be a party that the vast majority of people voted against. Hopefully this should stop Americans making nationalistic objections to me criticizing their system. I love the UK, I'm very patriotic about being British, but I can recognize that our electoral system is pretty crap too. However, I will point out that the UK kind of has an excuse for our crap system. See, we don't have a distinction between the Prime Minister, who's our executive branch, and the Houses of Parliament, which is our legislative branch. Instead, the Prime Minister is chosen through the way that we elect our local representatives in the House of Commons. And this means that the way we elect the Prime Minister necessitates a series of local elections. This tension between wanting a proportional system but also local representatives is really the main big political question regarding electoral reform in the UK right now. There are systems like SDV and mixed member party list, but both of those either necessitate having to introduce even more members of parliament, or else making it so some of the members of parliament don't function as local representatives. Right now, there is one MP per 100,000 people in the UK, and that's really nice because it means the MPs are actually able to function really well as local representatives because there's not that many people they have to be representing. But it does mean we have 650 representatives, and if we were going to then add more representatives in order to make the system proportional, we would have to increase to more than 650, which is already a pretty ridiculously high number, or make it so many of the MPs who are staying on as representatives would be representing much larger areas, which would then get rid of that nice effect of them being able to quite effectively represent people by not having to represent too many constituents. So there really is no easy solution to the UK's problem. But the thing is, the US doesn't have this excuse. They elect the House of Representatives independently from electing their president, so they could continue to have an ironically unrepresentative House of Representatives, but there's no reason why the president couldn't be decided by a straight popular majority vote. There literally isn't a trade-off here. I can't think of a single downside to having the president just be decided by a single national vote, and it would solve a whole load of issues and pointless complications. So yeah, the UK system isn't much better than the American one, but at least we have an excuse, whereas the Americans really don't. And this talk about separation of powers brings us to the penultimate issue with the Electoral College. And since we're running out of light, I tell you what. Oh wow. Do I have to manually set the white balance, or does it change? Oh crap, I think I'm going to change the white balance. October, man. We're post daylight savings time, and I've got like an ever vanishingly small window during which I can record these videos and have the lighting look remotely good. God, yeah, I need one of those proper I feel like at some point I should just bite the bullet and just commit to doing artificial lighting all the time. It would solve a lot of problems, especially considering the UK is very cloudy. Even when I'm going off natural light, suddenly a cloud will move out of the way and I'll be completely overexposed. Anyway, let's see if we can make the white balance a little bit better. I don't think that made a difference. Number 8, other institutions do its job better. So even though the Electoral College is at this point provably very stupid, I am just going to entertain two things it's supposed to do well. One, it's supposed to provide representation to smaller areas of the United States that might otherwise get ignored. And two, it's supposed to provide checks to a potential tyranny of the majority. I don't think it does either of these things well at all, but even if it did some of them well, there's no denying that there are other features of the US's constitutional democratic republic that do these things better. Regarding representation, obviously we should talk about the Senate, because when you consider Congress, the Electoral College just looks even more pointless, because basically the Electoral College provides local representation but slightly prejudices in favour of smaller states. Thing is, the House of Representatives is literally just local representatives who perfectly correspond to, or as close as realistically possible, correspond to the population of the area they're representing. Conversely, the Senate has a massive point in favour of smaller states because literally every single state gets the same number of senators. So if you have the House of Representatives, which focuses on population, and then you have the Senate, which completely ignores population and just focuses on the state, what's the point in this half-arsed Electoral College that kind of focuses on population, but also kind of focuses on which states have the smaller or larger populations, when essentially all that's achieving is an aggregate of what the legislature is achieving anyway. Of course, even if there was no consideration for the relative size of states in federal elections, it's worth noting the US is still a federal system, and as such, whatever the federal government is doing, states still have the ability, no matter how big or small they are, to decide their own affairs. So again, what's the point in having the Electoral College so Wyoming or Vermont or Alaska can have a slight bonus in their representation in presidential elections, when obviously the infinitely more valuable thing would be the 10th Amendment, which guarantees individual states an ability to a large extent control their own affairs. Surely that's the much more important protection for smaller states. So regarding defending smaller states, those are two institutions that clearly do a much better job at defending their interests than the tiny extra advantage they get in the Electoral College ever could. Now regarding defense against tyranny, again the Electoral College doesn't do anything that other institutions set out in the US Constitution don't already do much better. Firstly, as already explored, the US has all of these other branches of government which act as checks to presidential power, so clearly that's going to present some limitations to the president ever acting tyrannically. That the Senate and the states and the House of Representatives and the Supreme Court are able to push back against the president is clearly a much bigger defense against the president acting tyrannically than arbitrarily providing some extra votes to some random states and having it so an arbitrary minority gets to decide who the president is in a handful of swing states. Secondly, the US has a codified constitution which enshrines certain rights for people. So this whole talk about tyranny of the majority is kind of stupid anyway, because the whole point of the constitution is to make it so anything that the president would do that could be considered tyrannical is already illegal for them to do anyway. So if the Electoral College fails to stop a tyrannical president getting in charge because it's in no way equipped to do that, at least the Constitution, which specifically says legally they cannot do this tyrannical stuff, yeah, that should probably do the trick. And then of course there's the Supreme Court, which makes sure that the Constitution is being followed, and any citizen can appeal to the Supreme Court as an independent judiciary if they feel that their rights are being trampled on by something that they perceive to be tyranny. Again, I just don't see how a few random people in some swing states are supposed to be this big defense against tyranny in a way that a codified constitution and an independent judiciary aren't. For the record, I actually don't like any of these features of the US democracy. Regarding the Senate, I've already said I think that states are completely arbitrary, and I don't understand why it is that states aren't just constantly splitting up in order to exploit this feature of getting representation in the Senate by becoming a state rather than the amount of people who actually live in that state. I also prefer that the British system has no checks and balances, because this means the buck of responsibility clearly stops at one individual person. So if something goes wrong, we know to blame the Prime Minister, whereas in the United States, everyone can deflect. The president can say, oh, it wasn't my fault, it was Congress, they weren't letting me pass what I wanted to pass. Congress can say, oh, it wasn't our fault, it was the president, he was terrible. And then obviously everyone can blame the Supreme Court. I don't think that's actually a good system, personally. I think accountability is quite important in democracy, and that's something that's missing when you have these checks and balances, which means everyone can blame everyone else. And as for a codified constitution, it seems to me that as soon as you write out a list of rules, you're automatically inviting people to try and find loopholes, and it's insane to me how many little quirks there are in various institutions of US democracy that literally just exist to exploit these loopholes. And I'm kind of glad we don't have that in the British system, because we don't have this codified constitution where people can look for loopholes, and therefore, while I'm not going to claim the system's perfect, at least it's honest. But again, the point here isn't that I like the US system, like I say I don't, but the point is, if your concerns are representation for smaller states or protection against tyranny of the majority, clearly those other things I've just laid out here are much bigger and more important things to that effect than the Electoral College, which, like I say, doesn't actually achieve any of this stuff at all. By the way, considering the US does have all these different branches, it kind of seems stupid to me that they're all chosen by the same electoral system anyway. Like, surely it would make more sense to have different voting systems for each of the branches so each of them can reflect different democratic concerns. Like, really, the president should be decided by a nationwide ranked choice popular vote. And for those who don't know what that means, basically, it means that the person that people want the least will be the one who loses the election. This is, by the way, why, for example, in France, the far-right party always makes it to the final round of voting, but then they always end up losing at the last hurdle, because there's seemingly always going to be a majority of people who don't want a far-right party in charge, and therefore they're going to vote for whatever the alternative is. The main function of a ranked choice system is to basically make it so the least offensive candidate that people are the most tolerant of will win, which I think would be good for the US, where it seems like one of the founding philosophies is a general aversion to political extremism and a preference for liberalism. The House of Representatives could stay as it is, but really the Senate should be a proportional system, basically meaning that it exactly, or as close as possible to the nearest percent, reflects the popular vote, and this way slightly more extreme parties could get some representation as long as at least 1% of the US population supports them. And then finally you have the Supreme Court, which would be independent, not directly elected, and they make sure that everything's happening in accordance with the Constitution. I do think they should make the way that judges are chosen different so that it's less partisan, and I have ideas about how they can do that, but this isn't a fix the entire US electoral system video, this is the Electoral College's crap video, so I'll leave that to one side. But yeah, the point is, if you had this, then you would have a president who at least 50% of the US population was like, yeah, I'm fine with him being in charge, or her being in charge, obviously. Well, who knows? By the time this video is up, maybe there is a female president-elect, but I'll kind of touch wood on that because who knows. But yeah, you've got a president who everyone's like, yeah, I'm happy with that person. And then they, let's say, propose a piece of legislation, and then it goes to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives represents each individual area, so at least 50% of the locations that are represented in the House of Representatives would then need to approve of it. And then it would go to the Senate, where maybe you have some slightly more radical parties, and maybe they need to be appeased, and you change, and you kind of have to do some coalition building. So let's say, for example, you're a Republican, and you're a Republican president. You pass a piece of legislation, everyone representing all the different areas says it's fine, then it goes to the next area, and you don't actually have 50% of Republicans in the Senate. Maybe you've got some libertarians, and the libertarians will put you over the top. So you say, all right, libertarians, what can we change here to make it more appealing to you? If you're a Democrat, maybe you've got socialists or the Green Party, and you need to make it more appealing to them. So, it just allows the people who right now under the US system who vote for these minor parties or would vote for these minor parties that have basically no influence at all to have some influence, which I think would make sense. And then obviously at the end of it all, like already said, the Supreme Court is there to say, well, let's check that this lines up with the Constitution. Yes, it does. Boom. Now you've got a law. That seems to me to be a good way of doing things, which takes advantage of the fact that you have these different branches of government. So why have it all just basically function under pretty much the exact same system, which is some combination of a local election result that will either have no consideration for how many people live in each state, or some consideration, or basically a huge amount of consideration. And yeah, to me, that just seems like a good system that would provide checks and balances and represent all sorts of different people without any real risk of tyranny. And you'll notice it doesn't have the Electoral College, and I'm not sure how adding the Electoral College to that would fix anything or improve anything. Point number 8 was a little long, so I'll finish with point number 9, which is a very simple point. Most people don't want it. What I mean by this is pretty simple. Right now, most people who support the Electoral College are Republicans, and it's just so coincidentally, Republicans right now are advantaged by the Electoral College and the fact that it means, for example, I'm saying I'm interested in what the vote will be. Kamala Harris will almost certainly win the popular vote. It would be very surprising if she doesn't, but it still is hanging in the air whether or not she wins the election overall. So clearly it is to the advantage of the Republicans. But in 2012, when people briefly thought that Obama was going to lose the popular vote but win the election overall, Donald Trump was calling for the Electoral College to be abolished. If Republicans suddenly found out actually the Electoral College was hurting them and making it less likely for them to win, even though the majority of people wanted them in charge, they would support getting rid of the Electoral College. That's the truth. Most people recognize that the Electoral College doesn't serve any sort of purpose that's worth defending. It only serves the illegitimate purpose of sometimes meaning that somebody who most people don't want to be president can be the president sometimes. There are, to be fair, some people who support the Electoral College for non-partisan reasons, for non-cynical reasons. They genuinely support it because they think it's a good system, because they think that it achieves some kind of wonderful thing, that it's worth losing out on actually having a representative system. And I honestly have to say that I've got less than zero respect for such people. If you just support the Electoral College because it makes your guy more likely to win, even though you recognize that it's completely illegitimate and undemocratic, I can respect the hustle. If you're genuinely so moronic that you're no, actually, this is a wonderful system that I'm really glad we have, and it achieves a huge amount for our democracy, that we have this Electoral College system, you're a complete moron. Anyway, not too much to say in closing. This video ended up being a little bit longer than I was expecting it to be. Obviously, I don't usually talk about this stuff, so I guess if I was going to talk about something new, I should have not spent so long talking about it. If you made it through this whole video, well done. If you want to engage in the algorithm, that's really appreciated. I will say, if you're going to comment and try to defend the Electoral College, it's very likely that you are wrong. I just don't see how there is a good argument for the system, because clearly it's complete nonsense. Clearly it's crap. So if you're going to comment anything, probably just comment, "Good point, Michael, you're right about everything." Because, yeah. Look, if someone wants to make a response video to this where they address the points one by one and actually address these objections, I would kind of respect that, just because I'd be wow, I can't believe they even went for it. But I think it would be very unlikely that I'd walk away from it respecting their arguments. I don't see how anyone could say, no, actually, the Electoral College makes loads of sense. Anyway, I'll see you all later. Just a reminder of the whole Patreon thing. You can give on Patreon. If you do, you get access to bonus videos. Bonus videos, if you're thinking, oh man, you didn't make a video about the gender identity debate this week. Yeah, well, the election was going on. I was interested in it. I didn't want to make a video about implications of the US election in light of trans identity or whatever, because you know, I don't really care. You know, it's the US. It's a different country. I'm too busy focused on the UK. But I do get annoyed by these kind of broader systems. You know, the American whatever president will change from, you know, every 4 years, whatever. But this system they have, these rubbish, like, crap electoral system that they've got, the whole way the US government works, I think it's just complete nonsense. So yeah, I'm very happy to complain about that. Anyway, but yeah, if you're wanting more content to do with gender identity, then you can get that by going onto my Patreon, where I do bonus videos where I react to stuff that relates to gender identity, and I'll play a clip of that now.
So in an extremely online life, which is now normal for most people, validation is increasingly crucial. This is also a big part of the...
I don't get this thing. For whom and for why? Like, for me, someone said, like, I need to be validated online. I don't really... Like, I don't know what that means. Like, what about myself needs to be validated? I can't even like conceive of what that's talking about, except for in the case where you're obviously talking about something nonsense. Like, that's the only scenario I can imagine someone being like, I can't imagine black people need to be validated as black people when they're just black people. So if that looks appealing, then make sure to check it out, and I will see you all next week. Bye!